We're going to go over the grading, how we grade your work, and also study tips, how to do the study assignments required from week to week. First of all, description of the course, World History course. This is a 1 credit history credit. However, you also may use this as a Bible course or a Bible checkoff course. It also can be used for English grammar credit as an English composition. The course itself will compose of a minimum of 120 QSUs or for 1 credit. If you have additional QSUs through additional projects through the course of the year, you can apply those additional QSUs to other credit, such as grammar, and that will be allowed as you accomplish the work. For the basic description of the course, a biblical view of world history will be the primary focus of this course. Biblical history and parallel world events will be understood in light of providential purpose in all human events. You will be reading, writing, and listening to lectures as the primary instruction methods for this particular course. The syllabus for the course is as follows. First of all, the course is structured as a 10-week double lecture class. Now, we actually will have 11 weeks in the live class because the 11th week will allow for student oral presentations. For your portfolio, as we conduct the class from week to week, your portfolio is what you are required to accomplish and bring to class for each session that we meet. First of all, you're required to have a QSU log completed, which records all of your study and project accomplishments from session to session. You may purchase a comprehensive QSU log for all your courses, but if you want just one QSU log for this particular course, you may pick up a free one from the office. They're available today. Also, you will be completing class lecture notes, and you'll be keeping them in a notebook, proper section just devoted to class lectures, and you will keep these class lectures ordered in the proper order from 1 to 10 in the course of the class. Part of your assignment will be to listen to some additional audio lectures of other speakers, and we'll have those available for you on a lending library basis. However, you are required to take notes for those audio classes, and those notes are to be part of a section in your portfolio, and you want to keep those notes specifically by the date that you've done that assignment. So your notebooks might vary from each other if you're doing some of the same audio lectures because you did them in a different sequence. You're also going to be required to complete an outline of world history or a timeline, and that will be a separate section and part of your portfolio. And as also, you will be completing approved reading projects, which you will be sure to log on your QSU. Essays are required. Each week you'll be required to submit 1 essay, and that essay will be kept in a separate section also by the due date. And then, let's see, I think that's the primary summary. The structure is a 10-week course. The portfolio requirements are involved with that. For your information, if you're as a part of your handout this morning, I gave you a copy of the grade sheet. The grade sheet basically takes this portfolio requirements and transfers it into a mechanism for you to check off when you're getting ready for class, and for me to check off grading your work from class session to class session. Now, the syllabus continued. The composition of your grade is going to be roughly each session, each week we get together, you're to have completed a minimum of 12 QSUs. Now, the way it basically works is today's lecture, each day of a double lecture always counts for 3 QSUs with the completed notes as a part of it. Plus, you have then all the homework assignments between lectures. So when I receive your portfolio on the next session, 12 QSUs are the minimum required for you to have completed by that session. You'll be getting 20 points each week in terms of grading for making sure your QSU log is completed properly. You'll be getting 300 points per week for evaluating your class lecture notes that you're taking during this session. And you'll also be receiving 100 points each week for the written notes that you take on your own audio lectures from week to week or from session to session. Each session you'll be graded 200 points worth on your essay, your written essays that you'll be returning in, roughly 4 pages minimum. 3,000 points will be accumulated in the course of the entire course for your world history outline. And on your little handout that I gave you with your grade sheet, I broke that down for you just to understand 10 sessions. You'll be required to accomplish a minimum of about 300 grading points, or 3 QSUs per week or per session. And then also there's 3,000 points to finish and accomplish your approved reading projects for a total of 30 QSUs. And again, from session to session, you're going to be required to finish a minimum of 3 of those QSUs, which is about 45 pages, and I'll get into the details a little bit later. So in terms of your grade evaluation, you're going to accumulate a potential total of 12,200 points in the course of the year. Those points translate into 120 QSUs, and except for the evaluation of your QSU log, which goes towards your quality grade, essentially each QSU is worth about 100 points in terms of my grading evaluation. You can also earn extra QSUs, which you can apply to another subject area, as I've discussed earlier. Now, how am I going to grade your portfolio? How are you going to get your grade? Essentially, it's going to be like this. For an A+, you need to score between 12,200 and 11,703. A will be 11,702 to 11,347, and an A- will be 11,346 to 10,981. So that's your range for your A's. For a B, 10,981 to around 10.5, around 10.5 for a B to 10,127, and then for a B-, it's around 10,126 to 97.61. For a C, 97.60 to 92.63. C+. A C standard is 92.62 to 89.07. Well, I don't like that. That's a mistake. On this particular one, let me just fix the error. Thank you.
2 more times.
Pardon? I see. Well, they're at least on the same line. And for a D, we'll fix those others later. 76, essentially D is from 85 to 731, and then anything below 7320 is an F. So that's just how the score is going to be calculated in the course of the year. Now we're going to move a little bit to study tips, especially with some of these areas. First of all, class note taking. I'll have a little segment on that. We're going to talk about how to take notes on the audio cassettes. We're going to discuss the essay requirements. We're going to discuss the outline for the history requirements and also the reading project requirements. Start with class note taking. First of all, during lectures, you have in your possession a handout each week of the class notes. I'm giving you the handout in a similar fashion as we're using them on the PowerPoint, because that presentation makes it simpler for you to keep track. These things are roughly an outline, but it's just outlined on a PowerPoint. So when I give you notes, just as you noticed in, for example, in the last slide, I have a slide, and usually my slides contain a set of bullet-pointed notes, okay? So each of those segments, usually what I do in my presentation, one slide gives you the segment of all the bullet points we're going to cover, and then when we go to the next slide, I begin taking each one of those bulleted points and expanding on it. So that gives you a sense of structure. I'll always do that because that's just the simple nature of how PowerPoint works. It allows me to create sections and subsections. However, it's important for you to understand that when I write a note as a bulleted concept, you're still required to pay attention and then add to that bulleted concept the rest of the information. By way of general structure, when I give you the overview for the section that we're going in, I'm just going to mention those points briefly to give you a perspective, and then we're going to go one by one. So it's not till we get to this type of a slide where one of those bulleted points begins to get subpoints that you write next to the bulleted points the necessary concepts or detail for each bullet. A tip on doing that, pay attention to keywords. Usually the bullet narrows in on what the keyword is, and then I'll emphasize and discuss it in a little bit more detail. Often the nature of my lecture is such that I'm only really capable of putting an essential concept on paper, and then I discuss it with somewhat greater detail. And it's important for you to pay attention to catch keywords and then summarize that information. One of the most important parts of this class is that you learn lecture techniques for listening to lectures and reducing them to meaningful notes. And so explaining things in concise, complete sentences is the number one thing I'm going to be looking for in your notes when I look at your notes from week to week. Now, when I say concise, complete sentences, I'm meaning complete sentences, understanding that from a grammar standpoint, it doesn't have to be perfectly complete, but from a concept standpoint, it needs to be perfectly complete. This is the difficult part of videotaping a class lecture with a class wanting to ask questions. So what you need to do is, if possible, during a lecture, if I'm not making a point clear or you lost your way, try to ask a question then. If not, mark that point, but put a big question mark. And during our break, then will be an opportunity for you to ask those questions to me in detail. Obviously, if you're listening to this by DVD, you have the option of rewinding and listening to it again. Here in live class, you don't have that option. Also, I will grade your notes from session to session in an increasingly, I guess you could say, harder fashion. I'll try to point out in the early weeks mistakes that you're making, but as we go along, I'm going to increase. There's basically going to be 300 points for the notes each time. That's a lot of points, and I'm really going to be looking for you to have each of your little subsets of information clear, concise, and meaningful. You might ask a question, when are my notes complete or adequate? And the answer is, if you could take those notes and turn them into either an oral presentation or an essay. And so that's really the essence of it. Be neat and structured, and make sure you keep all your notes in a binder in order. As I mentioned to you earlier, we will be providing, for those of you here in the live class, a paper punch to keep things in your binder. Okay, moving on from class note-taking, we're going to talk about audio cassette note-taking. Audio cassette note-taking is a little bit different than class taking. First of all, there are no handouts, and so you have the responsibility for taking the notes in your own mechanism. You have an advantage in that as you listen carefully, you can actually stop the tape recorder, rewind it, and do it over. But what you're going to do again is be careful as you listen. Locate keywords. And what I always like to do when I'm listening to a lecture, I try to take a keyword that will help me remember the whole concept, and then I, next to that keyword, explain what that word means in fullest fashion necessary. I don't have to have a gazillion details, but that keyword should solicit for me a substantial amount of content so I understand what I'm talking about, because eventually then that keyword will trigger the whole concept for you in your mind. Thirdly, you should be able to reduce your notes to an outline of some fashion so that you could present it orally or write an essay from it, and actually your essay assignments will be taken from your lecture notes. That's one of the primary sources that your essays will take from. Fourthly, I will grade these notes from week to week on a harder basis as we go along. And lastly, be neat and structured and keep your things in a binder by date accomplished, because they will be graded from session to session. Third area of tips here. Essay requirements. Going over the essay requirements, I would like your essays to be a minimum of 4 to 5 pages for each class. When I say 4 to 5 pages, I mean 4 complete pages. If there's any spillover, it spills onto page 5. Okay? Now, some of you are more prolific writers, and this is an essay composition type of a course. So if you write essays beyond this minimum capacity, that's where you get the additional credit potentially for an English composition grammar course, for example. So remember, every week when you turn in your essay, it needs to be complete 4 pages, and if it spills over onto the 5th page. It's not a 3-page essay with a little bit of spilling over onto page 4, okay? Also, number 2, essays will be written from your choice of class notes, audio notes, or reading assignments. Let me go over that real briefly. Okay, here's an example where that's all I have in writing, but I'm going to cover 3 quick things, so pay attention to these. The first quick thing I want to say about this is your class notes. Okay, when you take your class notes and you're substantial about them, you'll notice, especially today, every one of my subsection discussions have the potential to be a very long essay, and because they're different topic areas. So when you go through my essay, I'm not saying that you have to take my essay and turn it back into, take my lecture and turn it back into an essay. But you can take a segment of my lecture and create an essay out of that. So your choice of essay topics are being exclusively left up to you. What you need to do is recognize that you summarize, minimally, you can write an essay summarizing the class lecture, or an essay summarizing an audio lecture that you listen to, or in your reading assignment, you can write an essay summarizing the reading assignment. So what would be the most creative, useful tool for you that I'm going to suggest is this. I suggest not trying to do a comprehensive essay on the whole lecture, but choosing a key element of the lecture and doing an essay on that particular kind of a topic. That will give you the most academic benefit in terms of developing your academic skills, and also it'll prove to be the most meaningful for you in terms of content as well. You are required to have a minimum of 10 essays completed, and they'll all be due from week to week. The only requirement that may change, as I mentioned to you a little bit in the informal chat, number 1, I may choose to cancel an essay one week and say, okay, next week no essays, there will be an exam on the content of today's lecture, and then your effort will be put into the disposition of preparing for the test instead of the essay. Also, I may substitute for the essay an oral presentation. And you will do one oral presentation at the end of the year, but I may choose to substitute that. So let me just pause for a moment and help you think, okay, what is an essay then? Well, an essay is a comprehensive summary of a significant idea. That's really all an essay is. It's a comprehensive summary of a significant idea. Now, there are, if you think of an essay as a comprehensive summary, you can have it in a composition form. That's what essays are traditionally. But that's where, if you're learning to use an outline technique in terms of structuring ideas, then the outline technique gives you that comprehensive structure. So from that outline structure, you can write a written essay, or you can do an oral essay. And an oral essay is what? An oral presentation. Essentially, my lectures are essays. Each week when I do an essay, when I do a lecture as I am, it's actually an oral essay. Okay? And then thirdly, a third kind of essay, which is a little bit clumsy in your thoughts, an exam is also an essay because it's comprehensive and structured. However, it's just structured somewhat different. Now, continuing, your next responsibility will be to accomplish something I'm calling an outline of history project. And the requirements for that include the following. Number 1, each student is required to complete an outline of the world or a timeline of world history. Now, you might ask me at this point, what's the difference between an outline and a timeline? Well, in your first handout that I gave you of the textbook, we will be using the Becca textbook as our primary reader, unless you select an additional text with my approval. But This particular textbook gives you a very brief kind of timeline introducing each particular chapter, which is a little bit of an illustration of a timeline. An outline is different from a timeline in that an outline follows standard outline techniques, and so your major Roman numeral points give you your primary structure, and then off of those major Roman numeral points you have your subsections or your substructures. And so actually a timeline is an academic presentation that gives you a visual presentation of an outline. So there's not a lot of difference in terms of the content between the outline and the timeline. It's just the visual presentation. If you choose to do a timeline, do it in such a fashion that we don't have to unfold this really long sheet and paste it around the wall to look at your timeline. But do it in a fashion that you can put the papers, as you flip the paper from end to end, you can see the content flow from slide to slide in your presentation. Remember that the central outline or timeline framework must be Bible history. Now that's a requirement that I'm imposing on this. So when you think of your essential structure of history, that when we'll begin that in lecture 2 in terms of giving a basic view of biblical history. What we're looking at is we're going to take the biblical parameters. Simply stated, Genesis is the beginning of time at the creation, and Revelation is the end of time at the return of Christ and the establishing of the millennium and the bringing New Jerusalem down to earth. And in between those 2 points unfold all of the particular history of the world, of which some of that history is expressly recorded in the Scripture, and some of it has large gaps. So there are many parts of history not in the Bible. It doesn't make those parts of history not history. It just makes them recorded in a non-biblical resource. But we are going to stick to the central outline or the central timeline being a biblical outline of history. When you come to each session from week to week over the 10 weeks here following, when you come from week to week, what's going to happen is I want you to complete a minimum of 3 QSUs. There's 30 QSUs in your outline. Basically, you want to do a 1/10 of the project each time. There's a loose understanding that 3 QSUs require a minimum of 3 solid working hours on your assignment. But I do want to say that I won't judge your work just because you said you'd spent 3 hours on your outline. I mean, if in 3 hours all you produced was a line and 3 words, I'm not real impressed for 3 hours of work. Okay, so the idea is, as you work on this timeline from time to time, there needs to be a substantive amount of work in it equaling 3 QSUs, or about 3 hours of work for each session, which is minimum requirement. And then I'm going to determine your grade based on the quality and the completeness. And you could, for example, have an A in quality, and you could have instead of getting 30 QSUs, I'm only going to give you 15 QSUs because it's not complete. Okay, so your grade is going to cover the quality of your work, but the QSU is actually completing the assignment. To get 15 QSUs on this assignment will be an incomplete grade. You won't get your credit because you'll be missing 15 QSUs. Now, here's a little reminder to you in terms of the whole spectrum, all of these projects that we're doing. There is some fluid motion between projects, okay? If you happen to be skilled at doing a wonderfully quality-oriented timeline or outline, and yet the content size is only going to get 15 or 20 QSUs, with permission from the instructor, you may select to do some additional other projects to complete that 10 or 15 QSUs that you're missing if that's necessary. But in this particular case, those are exceptions made exclusively by the instructor in the course of the year. Concerning your reading projects, every week you will be doing some reading assignments, and I've blipped them all up at one time here. minimum requirements. During the whole course, you will be completing 450 pages minimum from a standard textbook. So when I say a standard textbook level, I'm talking about high school textbook level of quality. You'll be completing minimum of 450 pages. Now, you may have reading resources that are specifically from me. Number one, we are using by recommendation the Becker World History as our primary reader. Number two, I have with the 12 cassette World History, I have also a small reader that's accompanying that. So if you're, when you're taking the, when you're borrowing the tapes from that particular set of lectures, you may also take with you those segments of the reading assignment, and those pages will equivocate. So what may happen is, in the course of your reading, I'm going to be looking for a minimum of 450 approved pages. However, some of your pages may not be from exclusively the Becker history book per se. And so we'll have a balance in that particular approach as we go through on. Number two here, reading sources, number three, QSU log is required to show amount of reading and time spent reading. Just a quick comment about recording for your QSU log. Again, I'm giving you a grade every week on the QSU log because I want you to present your work in a way that I can easily see it. The squares on there are sufficiently laid out for you to do the following. Number one, on your QSU log, you will write a particular date. On this day, September 29th, on that particular day, what did you read? You'll actually list the name of the book and the pages. Now, you can use the briefest name of the book to refer to that book as possible because it'll be a consistent entry throughout your QSU log. That's fine. But you must identify the source and the number of pages that you're reading, okay? For your information, okay? The total QSUs for reading 450 pages for this class, the total QSUs is 30. So if you divide 450 pages by 30, it gives you 15 pages per QSU, okay? Now, when you look at your QSU log, there's a little spot that says how many pages equals one QSU, and you just enter that in there, 15 pages equals one QSU. So that as you then mark your reading, I read from page 99 to page 114. I enter in my QSU log those pages, but then I mark under the QSU section 1 QSU, because that's the amount of reading that you accomplished. And that's important because as you switch your reading, and one day you're reading the textbook, and the next time you're doing a special reading assignment, those pages, every 15 pages qualifies as a QSU, and so you're accumulating 450 pages. Also, in your tally box, you will maintain a running tally of the total pages. So not only do you enter how many QSUs, but you enter total pages read each day. So those things become accumulated as the year goes on. Now, it's very easy to enter your QSU log accurately. It's very common for people to be very sloppy and very hurried because they're not really thinking of the detail as important. The detail is important, so I'm going to grade your QSU log according to the quality of entry. Next point, when you're doing outlining and note-taking for your lectures, stop and think. It may be possible for you also to do some outlining and note-taking on the reading, especially if the reading is of particular interest to you. Now, this will be helpful to you if you're going to write an essay, okay? Let's say you're reading a segment of your textbook, and it's a very interesting segment, and you want to do your essay on that segment. Well, pay attention then. As you're reading, reduce that textbook into an outline so that you can turn that outline into an essay, okay? That's a very important practice, and we took some time in the government class. If you're interested in getting a more comprehensive class on outlining hard textbooks, that's a class you can take for that purpose. But I'm recommending to you to use outline techniquing to write a couple essays. That's the suggestion I have. Then lastly, if you're writing an essay from the reading assignment, we're going to use a research technique for those essays. And the research technique, which I didn't have on your slide, it's your little note you can write on the side. The research technique is called general interpretation, okay? You're going to interpret the reading assignment with a particular view of cause and effect, consequence of action. So you're not just going to be reciting the list of history, but you're going to be bringing an interpretation to that history in some meaningful fashion. And that's the way I would like to see your essays written from any textbook reading that you do. This ends the introduction. We're going to just pause here so the DVD can be recalibrated for section 2, and you can have a brief break, and then we'll